Good afternoon. This is Critical Talk with Professor Amina Aldine. And I should say that we're streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. And we're also being hosted by Roku, Apple TV, and Galaxy 19. Uh, Today we're going to talk about women of color in American Islam. And women of color in American Islam make up almost all of the women in American Islam. Not all, but mostly. There's always been a lot of talk about Muslim women. Some of it, and my guest will clarify this, has not always been a part of the discussion about Islam in America. It comes a little bit later. Prior to this little bit later, American Muslim women have just largely gone on about their business. They have worked, been educated, and live in a kind of a different space inside of largely Christian families, some having multiple faiths in their family. But the hardships that come a little later as they're asked to answer for their sisters in belief across the waters. Some of the things that have happened here with regard to Islamophobia, all kinds of things have happened with Muslim women in spaces of services, whether it's the hospital, the bank, the restaurant, or even their children's school. So today with me, discussing women of color in American Islam, I have Dr. Sylvia Chan Malik, who is an associate professor in the Department of American and Women and Gender Studies. Oh, I messed that up. Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. They need to stop changing names on me. At Rutgers, New Brunswick. That's in New Jersey for those of you who live in the Midwest that don't think anything exists outside of the Midwest. uh, where she directs the social justice program, chairs the faculty advisory board of the Center for Islamic Life, and teaches courses in race and ethnicity in the United States. Um, what can I say? There's too many hats to wear, but they often happen with women of color in academia, which we'll come to also. Um, She is the author of Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color in American Islam, which I happen to adore this book because it opens so many doors for discussion. And the reason we're talking about it today is we haven't had much discussion about this topic. And I am sure that this will be an exciting conversation. Her PhD is in ethnic studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and she has a Master in Fine Arts in Creative Writing, of which I'm jealous, from Mills College, and is an advisory board member of the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, which we call Muslim Art. Welcome to the program, Dr. Chan Malik.
Thank you so much, Professor Amina. It's so nice to be with you. I always love talking to you. So thanks so much for having me.
Oh, not as much as I love talking to you, but I have my copy of the book right here.
With that beautiful artwork, I always need to shout her out by Kelly Crosby, who's an African American.
We put up the picture of the cover of this book and enlarge it just a little bit because it is important artwork.
Yeah, no, I was really so honored and grateful that Kelly Crosby, as I said, Kelly Itzahar Crosby, who's based in Atlanta, Georgia, an African American Muslim artist who does amazing. I have one of her paintings hanging in my office as well. Allowed me to use this image called Henna Hands for my cover.
Isn't that great, though?
It's beautiful.
Henna Hands. Look at all the colors, reaching, touching each other, things we can't do right now. But it is. It's gorgeous artwork. And oftentimes, as you know, when publishers don't, they decide they know better than we do what should be on the covers of our book. So to be able to choose and to have the artist say yes is phenomenal.
Yes, it was I was very grateful for that. I was grateful there is, oh, well, we can talk about it later, but a Muslim woman in a burqa on the cover. They want to put that on
I
every
tell
cover.
you all the time. Mhm.
But that didn't happen. I had a wonderful editor, a wonderful press, NYU press, so that didn't happen at all. But I'm just saying, I've heard stories of that happening.
Oh yeah. I mean, it is, well, wouldn't this look better? And although you say no, it still winds up being there.
Mhm.
So that's always interesting. But though I was drawn to these hands, couldn't figure out where it came from until, of course, I read the book. Um, and that is exciting. But the first question is, what was your inspiration for
Mhm.
this book?
Well, I've been asked that a number of times. And so, you have these stock answers that you reply to questions. And so, generally, what I say is I wrote this book for my daughters. I wrote this book because writing the book coincided with me finishing my dissertation at UC Berkeley, and then going into my first full-time academic job. And in the process, raising three mixed race, African American and Asian American Muslim girls in the United States, right? And the book, books evolve as you write them. And so I always kind of kept in mind that I wanted to write something that they could find their own history and narratives in that I didn't see out there already, that didn't
Yeah.
exist. And it was almost like a process of learning how to be a Muslim woman, a Muslim mother, someone who was very invested in social justice, racial justice, gender justice issues, trying to figure out what that was. That was what the book was for me. That really motivated me at every step of the way, trying to figure out, what? There are women who have come before me who were concerned about all these same things. And I wanted to tell their stories, and I wanted my daughters to know about them and their lives and their histories. For when they were dealing with these same questions in their
Uh-huh.
lives. Yeah, so that was my motivation. As I kind of reflect back, the book was published 2 years ago. I realized more and more it was me figuring out how to be as a Muslim woman as well. Engaging all of this research. And really seeing that the history that I experienced, coming from Oakland, California, and really coming out of a space in which Black Muslims and African American Islam was everywhere, and then into a post 9/11 world, that this wasn't really reflected in the existing scholarship and literature, definitely not in popular culture or media, right? Uh, so it was kind of like me saying, no, you have to make this space. You have to make this space where this narrative is, because this is really what people are telling me, and this is really what I'm experiencing. So there is a need for this. So that was another motivation where it's like, well, these women are every bit as much of this history as, all the men that we have read books about. People like Malcolm X, people we should read books about, right?
Right.
But there were these women there the whole time, and
Thank you.
they did many, many, many things.
Well,
That's
many of the men might not have been there had it not been for those women.
Mhm. I mean, that was really, so my husband is, a second generation African American Muslim. And so, hearing his mother's stories and his aunties and all the women, they were on the go,
Yeah.
they built schools, they had groups, they were working, they did things, so that's why I said, how come we don't know about this? So,
Well, it might have been because they were on the work, on the go, working in movements, working in organizations. No. And like you were just saying, the impetus was to prop up the men,
mhm.
as opposed to the women's work, which was just as valid, and then many times it was their work that propped up the men. to do what they had to do. But that's what makes the take you have in this book. And I'm going to go through the book. I hope you have your copy ready. There you go. Um, and
I was talking to you. I had to be ready. So,
but first, before we get to my first, and I don't know if this picture is one of them that we have talked about. Whoops, let me go this way.
oh yeah.
Do we have a bigger picture of that?
I did not share a slide of that, but that is a picture that's in the introduction of my book.
Okay.
Featuring Sister Sonia.
Well, it sets the stage. And it's one of the things that I want to get, because you're also a professor of, of American studies. And I want to get to that as soon as we take a break. Please feel free to drink your coffee or your tea, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Billboards are popping up all over the country with an
Our neighbors don't realize that Muslims are absolutely opposed to ISIS.
Salam. My name is Abdul Malik Mujahid. I'm an imam in Chicago.
16 shots! No me! No justice! No me!
So how do we bring up the energy which can really have an impact on the world? You need to build bridges of understanding among people, and we need to have America moving forward.
That lesson learned brought the strength of humanity to America, which is the diversity.
Mujahid Talks, only on Muslim Network TV. Faithfully connected.
We are back, and I'm here this afternoon with Dr. Sylvia Chan Malik, who has all those gorgeous plants over her head that I wish I had some down in my study, but nevertheless. One of the things that caught me about the picture I just showed, and I will show it again, is in Black World, which was a journal, you have economic aspects of Pan-Africanism. And you have, is this Frank Marshall Davis juxtaposed with Sonia Sanchez and her newest poems. And one of the things that has always been there in American studies is every time African Americans have something to say, it is there's issued a caution to us that, oh, they're talking about Black nationalism or Pan-Africanism, when it's just as humans and truly Americans having something to say. And that's one of the things that shapes the narratives, not only about African Americans in American studies, but also if you have anything to say about African American Muslims. It's always in protest. It's never as human beings having something to say about the society in which they live.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I didn't want to cut you off.
Go ahead.
No, I was actually, so as you stated in the beginning, I'm a scholar of race and ethnic studies.
Right.
I studied that. I was also majored in literature and culture at UC Berkeley. But, the study of race within the United States has always been at the center of my scholarship and research.
Right.
And so within that space, it's like you said, the only way that I ever saw Muslims being represented, especially in the post 9/11 era, right? And I'll talk about African American Muslims in a minute, was really as objects of state power. And so everything that Muslims did was just a reaction to somehow being marginalized or being surveilled or being oppressed or being punished, right, in some way, right? And so for African American Muslims as well, right? They were also always just seen as a political organization. They
Right.
were seen as people who were, speaking truth to power only through a political lens.
Right.
Right. And that was, what C. Eric Lincoln and all of those who wrote about them in the 1960s and 70s positioned them as a political organization. Right. They were just the new Black nationalists. They were separate.
Exactly.
Right. They were not religious, spiritual, complicated human beings.
Right.
And it was only when I started reading, which was not something that we would read normally in American or ethnic studies or race studies, work like yours, work like African American Islam, where I saw the ways in which you were engaging Islamic terminology, asabiya and ummah, and these types of concepts that are religious and spiritual discourses, right? That African American Muslims are engaging, that I started to see that, this community has been engaging with these questions in such a nuanced and complicated, right, vast way that, like you said, is never reflected in this type of generally very politicized, masculinist, right, and sort of revolutionary language.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that is, unfortunate because you lose so much.
Well, when it comes to women, you lose even more because women don't separate. I'm just speaking in general terms. Every act becomes political. Even being spiritual becomes a political act, especially if you're sitting in the midst of a largely Christian society and sometimes a largely Christian family where you may have, African Americans have some Buddhists, they have some Black Jews, they have, some wannabe Hindus and all kinds of people sitting there, and some atheists and some agnostics. So every act becomes a political act, but spirituality is what drives what you say and how you respond to many, many things. But it's never really talked about. And if you don't mind, I will go to page 14, where you talk a little bit about Sonia Sanchez and other Black women embraced Islam as a space of safety and sanctuary from anti-Black racism and sexual violence, which is very true and little talked about also. And I happen to know Sonia Sanchez, and it is very little talked about because that is seen somehow, again, on one hand, as putting African American Muslim women in a box that is devoid of spirituality. But at the same time, for many Black women, it is more than accurate. They are looking for a space of safety. And we'll come back to that again when we get to the Nation of Islam. When you have women who haven't had I don't know if it's a privilege or a right or it just is, the opportunity to just be wives and mothers, right?
Yeah.
Who have, because of a continuing slave narrative, been the objects of sexual violence, whether it's domestic violence or other violence, and the violence that they have subsequently come to bring on themselves or do themselves. It's a statement that needs to be made and thought about. You also have on page 15, you say this book approaches Islam in the United States as a lived religion. I love that. And a racial religious form, paying careful attention to how gender informs understandings of each term, as well as how Islam has historically functioned at times as a signifier of political ideology, which we just kind of talked about. But I want you to say more about that statement. I underlined that statement and used it in class before I retired. And I love it.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, so that is really the passage that you just read, that is really the central argument and contention of the book, right? And what I call that, and I'll explain a little bit more, that engagement between people's and in particular women's lived experiences and the ways in which certain stereotypes or images of Islam, of Blackness, of Black womanhood exists in society. What I call that engagement, that meeting point, is affective insurgency. And so what I mean by that is that I experienced in a post 9/11 world that there was no way to be a Muslim woman and go outside, or if I would go outside in a scarf when I was going to prayers, or there was no way to walk outside without being painfully and consistently aware, right, that you were Muslim in a post 9/11 world, right? You're just aware of it. Everyone knows that. Every Muslim woman who wears a scarf or even doesn't wear a scarf knows that feeling, right? Where you are constantly kind of gauging the safety of each space you walk into. What is that guy? How is he looking at me? Is that a threat? You know, or you walk into a job interview or a classroom. So I knew that feeling. I knew it in my body, right? And then I thought about, but that feeling cannot be applied to someone like Betty Shabazz, right? Malcolm X's wife and then widow, Sister Betty Shabazz, Dr. Betty Shabazz, right? That same, you know, she was dealing with a whole other political formation in which Islam meant something else that had to do with Blackness, that had to do with threat, right, to white communities at that time, the hate that hate produced. So her conception of how to be a Muslim woman is very different than mine, or, you know, a young girl on a college campus right now. So that was what I was trying to capture, that Muslim women are always, right, responding to some version of Islam in the American imaginary that is both racial and religious. It exists in the nation's racial kind of imaginary and the ways we talk about religion in this country. And then it's about the way that Muslim women actually feel. Because like you said, it's so complicated, spirituality. Why do we engage in spiritual practices? How do we do that in the spaces of our lives? That's what I'm just as a scholar, that's what I'm interested in.
Let me interject. Can we go back to that picture wherever my producer is? I want to point out something. Can we have that picture back? Today, tomorrow?
Oh, the Betty Shabazz.
All right. Now, if you look at her, the head covering she has is an African Gaelic. And many in the American psyche, that is one typical and accepted headdress for women of African descent. And it doesn't necessarily draw attention to the fact that you're Muslim. The fact that her sleeves are 3/4 doesn't say anything here or there. Now, inside the Muslim community, it's, oh my God, you don't have on an Arab headdress, so you can't be Muslim. And oh my God, your sleeves are only 3/4 length. You definitely are not Muslim, although few of them, well, probably many, said it to her face, not knowing she's Malcolm X's wife. She's just another Black person out there because they haven't taken the time to find out who she is, right? Or to give the space for the difference among us, right? And Dakota Staton, who's on the right-hand side, who I had the privilege of hearing sing many times, was very careful in the space of the jazz club about, even though at some later points in her life she becomes an alcoholic and some other things, but she was very careful about what was offered to her in drink, keeping the wolves at bay, which plagued so many artists, you know, trying to get them addicted to drugs and this and that and the other. But she was also very forthright about her Muslimness and talking between performances and after them, as was Yusef Lateef. So it becomes like a really complicated environment.
Right.
in
Right.
which to function. Go ahead.
And that was, I'm so sorry, just to really quickly say, that's what I was interested in, because the way people talk about Muslimness, like that's a word I use in the book as well,
Right.
in the post 9/11 war on terror place, is that, you know, Muslims are these people who are from the Middle East, they're Arabs, the women dress like this. And we talk about it, I mean, in a very orientalized, timeless fashion.
Right.
That's what Muslims always were.
Right.
And we do this in the United States with zero recognition that there has been a Muslim community here that has so deeply influenced American culture, right? I mean, the most famous Muslims in the world are Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, right? Like in the world, I would make that argument, right? They're the well-known Muslims in the world. So this is a culture that has produced global figures and ways of thinking, right? That have impacted people all over the world. Yet we talk about Islam, you know, in this country as if that doesn't exist.
Exactly.
So that is like that was.
Where does that come from? If you asked an African American, they would say there has been a takeover of the definition of Islam in America by the immigrants, and so what they're trying to do is erase that African American Muslim history.
Mm-hmm. You know, I would say, I mean, this is a very simple answer to a question that, you know, you can answer so many ways, but at the very base of it, it is anti-Blackness. It is anti-Blackness that causes the white Americans, and I looked at articles from the 1960s where they would even say, oh, Islam as an ancient religion as practiced in Arabia is such a beautiful, it's so ironic. Right? Because they were praising the Islam of Arabia, while these Black Muslims, they're not real Muslims. They're preaching hatred, right? So on the part of the white media and white political establishment at that time, they are not even giving African-American Muslims, right, the kind of the anti-Blackness is so deep so that you can say, oh, their Islam isn't even real, right? That's what the white media was saying at that time. Right. And then the anti-Blackness into the present, kind of that bleeds into the portrayal where all of a sudden this entire history is just erased, right? And in a way almost wished away, right? And you have others, you know, because of the struggles of African Americans during civil rights, who are now able to immigrate to this country or come to this country for opportunities. Many of the Muslims that are here today since the 1960s and 70s, who themselves, you know, for whatever reason, being new Americans or whatever, and are not taught this history at all, also have no idea of this history of African American Islam. So you have anti-Blackness sort of eliding and obstructing this history and this experience and this presence from every direction.
Well, how does one, not you, how does one come to contend with an Islam that is anti-Black? And by that, not Islam itself, but, you know, where is Islam if there are no Muslims practicing it? And the Muslim practice of Islam is full of anti-Black stuff across the world, because it's not just here in America, then what do we do with that?
I mean, so much of the work, again, of Muslim women like yourself. I know a friend of yours, Sister Amina Wadud, Auntie Amina, right? Looking at Islamic texts and really situating them. And I mean, as a scholar and someone who is a cultural historian, right? We understand that the Quran is a historical document as well. I mean, we understand that. And there's a beautiful line in the first chapter of Layla Ahmed's book, Islam and Gender, where she says, there have always been these traditions, these patriarchal interpretations, you know, or whatever, kind of male-dominated interpretations of Islam. But women have always read that book and known that there was something that was speaking directly to them in their hearts, right? That a woman anywhere could read that and say, you know what, this is for me. Allah, God is speaking directly to me, right? And so with that in mind, right? To know that Quran is a historical document that speaks directly to people's hearts, right? To understand that context and to try to, I guess just as a scholar, I wanted to understand how women are reflecting that and living that, and then coming up against, right, those structures that have interpreted in different ways. And as you say, like, how do we contend with an Islam? Well, you know, change is incremental, right? We have to have these works, your works, other work, you know, and slowly, right? It doesn't happen kind of in a flash, or, you know, but I think that these stories and these new ways of looking at sacred texts will eventually start to shift certain structures and hierarchies of power.
I want to take another quick break, and I want to come back and talk about gender and sexuality, notions of it, perceptions of it, self-perceptions. I don't know how I feel about it, except I wish that women would get it together. But nevertheless, we will come back and talk about it after this quick break.
Assalamu alaikum!
I love Adam's world because it makes me learn in a fun way. That Adam has a green face and orange hair. I like this song. I like how Adam sings. I like Adam's world because it makes me happy. What? No. 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 And here's Adam and here's Anissa. Adam is and his sister. Adam is a boy and he is very smart.
Download the new Adam's World app at adamsworldapp.com and let's help tomorrow's Muslims today.
This is Professor Amin Al-Din in Critical Talk with Dr. Sylvia Chan Malik, who is the author of Being Muslim, Women of Color in American Islam. And I want to get to the talk about gender and sexuality, which we have too little talk about it in a future show. And I think I'm going to ask you to come back. I wanted to discuss the hoopla about cuties. Network thing, because I'm not too sure what's going on. I do have an idea, and that is that the hegemonic narratives are determined to stay in place and not discuss some things we need to discuss. In the book, you have kind of two chapters I want to get at. One is chapter 2 on insurgent domesticity, and where you're talking about the women in the Nation of Islam. Could you talk to us a little bit about that chapter?
Sure. And I think it actually, when I was writing the book, I think about that chapter in relation to the next one. So I know you were going to link them, because we both think about categories as someone who also works in a women and gender studies department, right? Engage in institutions and structures, right? In this case, heterosexual marriage, right? Traditional marriage and traditional family structures that are oftentimes labeled by second wave feminists or, you know, certain kind of radical progressive feminists as oppressive institutions, right? And so what we're grappling here with a lot of the times, I think, is a crisis of epistemology. Like, how are we engaging those terms, right, in this moment? Family, marriage. And, you know, we're speaking today, we were talking about it before we started taping, of this debacle that was the presidential debates last night. And one of the most fascinating things to watch in these, you know, and horrifying at the same time, is the way in which evangelical Christians, right, have lined up behind President Trump, right? And so it really kind of just fascinated me because, you know, as people of faith, you think, oh, morality is so central. And this man seems so amoral. So I started doing a lot of, you know, research myself into the history of the Christian right. And there is a particular notion of family that is very central to the Christian right. But whiteness is also central to that, right? It is the white Christian family, right? And so in a lot of, you know, books and research I've read, what I've come to see is that Trump represents for a certain segment of the population kind of a last grasp at centering the white Christian family in this country. So we come to think of family in that way, as an oppressive, sort of, you know, problematic institution because of that affiliation. But what I wanted to say in these chapters is for African American women and for African Americans and for people of color more broadly, you know, for Asian Americans who were laborers in the fields, or for Latino farm workers, right? Being able to be married and have a family was not the same as having, you know, a Leave It to Beaver life in the suburbs, right? You know, because that's what we're talking about when we're saying make America great again. Like, that's what people want, like that kind of.
Yeah, but at the same time, these large and small Christian communities, the impetus for women is a hyper femininity. It is sewing and cooking and having giads of children. And I was watching this special on I forget his name, with the fundamentalist Mormon church, and I'm saying, oh my God, where'd you get those hairstyles from and that dress? But nevertheless, you know, it is that on one side, but on the other side, femininity or lack thereof is politicized.
Oh, yeah.
In every political movement worldwide.
Right. And so what I found when I was researching chapter 2, looking at the ways in which the women of the Nation of Islam were portrayed in the media, how they were talked about, was in that moment in the 1950s, right? Issues of gender, in particular in the white American community, right, were profoundly kind of ensconced in a language of crisis, right? You had the burgeoning kind of beginnings of the white second wave feminist movement coming into national consciousness, women saying, no, we don't want these gilded cages in the suburbs, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique being published at that time, you know, and we see the show Mad Men, you know, white women feeling like these are prisons that our men put us in the suburbs, right? And so you have women like Kate Millett, who I write about the book, who, you know, burn their bras and, you know, go out and say marriage is a terrible institution. And this actually sends, you know, kind of the American mainstream into, you know, fear and loathing for these women. Like, who are there? They are upsetting the entire power structure.
Right.
So when the Nation of Islam comes in, and you see these beautiful, like Gordon Parks's image of these beautiful men in ties and these women in these white habits, you know, orderly, calm, raising their children. You know, what I realized in the response to that in the media was that heightened the threat, right, of what they seem like to people so much more. Because not only were they, you know, saying, you know, this is a Black religion, these are Black spaces, we are going to cultivate our own power in this community, in this organization, but look at our families.
Right.
We are in order. Our women are not going out and traipsing around. You know, our families are intact, right? And this was something that was very threatening. Right? To many of the commentators who were, and that was what I noticed about that. So the actual kind of heteronormativity of that family within the Nation of Islam was actually radical in the face of, right, this gender anxiety that was going on in the country. So again, like, you know, we have to be able to acknowledge that complexity. That while family on the one hand for white women was being seen as this incredibly, you know, kind of patriarchal, demeaning institution, for Black women, it was a way to reclaim, right, a strength, a power, and a position, right, that they had not had, and to find, you know, a potential place of safety, right? A potential place of safety. Sometimes that promise was not fulfilled, but it was the potential for it.
That's very true. I was thinking about another thing, and because I got so much I want to get to, and I'm gonna bring you back on when I do cuties, because
Oh, right.
some of the stuff that you have in here is so pertinent um, to it. Is the gender and sexuality part. While Black women have always had their issues with domestic violence, gender violence, etc., their handling of it was a little bit different. And my even trying to explain, me being Muslim longer than you are old, that wait a minute, there was a time when the issue, I mean, if I saw a Muslim woman in a veil, that was an oddity. It was not the now new demand. And Muslim women acquiescing to be in the back of spaces and other rooms and all this other craziness. You know, you had a hard time selling that even to Black women who are saying, whoa, 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 what are you talking about here? You know, explain some of your historical take, because you do it so much better than me and my screaming all over the place.
Well, I don't agree with that at all. But I mean, so much of this was, you know, I am not a trained anthropologist or an ethnographer.
Me either.
But before I went into academia, I was a journalist. I worked as a journalist for, 3 years, right? And so part of how I did research for the book was I just talked to people. I mean, I did I kind of gathered the research and wrote this book. It was first my dissertation and then became the book over the course of 10 years. Like, that's how books happen. And so I spoke to so many women who said things just like what you said. They told me these stories that were, again, like I said at the beginning of our conversation, so different than any perception of Muslim women that you would ever engage. And these were large groups. And this was not just kind of one isolated experience. I went to Black Muslim women in the Midwest, where my husband is from, on the East Coast, in California, in the South. And this was a kind of, there was a shared experience that was so powerful to me, where things like women would say things like, well, I don't want to be in the same room as the men. We want our own space. I see them all day long. Like, we want our own, we're doing our own thing. Give us our own space and leave. Like, they would say like that. So you have a very different kind of idea than now. Yes, absolutely. I think we should have masjids that are inclusive and everybody needs to, feel welcome.
You can also have, but our community, you got to remember, was a community where the person who had memorized the most Quran was not wearing pants, may have been the woman in the place. Right. And so we had situations where there had to be a female khatib, right? Because it became an issue of knowledge, which gets wiped out when immigrants get here. And now back to fighting about gender.
Right. And because there's a completely different conception of gender. And so what again happens is, because, most, non-Black or immigrant Muslims, right? Or, I mean, this is a failure of the American educational system of this nation in general, that we just we are so terrible at showing the complexity of human life in this country, right? But the fact that there is not even an awareness that these kind of second wave feminist ideas might not be the way, right, to get your freedom in this country, right? There might have been women who have been here, and there were, of course, as we're talking about, who've been here for decades, for centuries, who want what, I like to call gender justice, right? In a mold that is germane and grounded in the place where we are. And is very cognizant and aware of the injustice that surrounds us all the time, right? Oh, and another thing I thought about all the time was, when I was writing the book, is who's teaching the children how to pray?
Hey, let me tell you, it has become such an issue, and I wanted to get to how we negotiate these differences, because if you were coming and you needed a space where you could learn a different modality, you missed that bus, right? And then thinking about many of the African American women I talk to who are in such an uproar over just everything that immigrants have brought with them, not necessarily because they want to fight it, but sometimes it's, can I help you? And we have a question and a comment out here that says, do you feel that indigenous Muslim voices were silenced with the arrival of immigrant Muslims? And my answer is hell yes, but I'll let my guest answer.
Well, I mean, I will say it in the way that there were institutions that were built with blood, sweat, and tears. There were people who, like you said, against all odds, constructed Muslim identities, Muslim practices, traveled the world in times when they were not, it wasn't easy to do things like that, who made Hajj like in the 50s and 60s and 70s when it was not simple to do something like that. African American Muslims did all of this. They built the masjids, they built the schools, they built the institutions. And what happened over and over again, I hear this story, I've heard it so many times, it breaks my heart, is that when many of the immigrant Muslims came, they started going to these masjids, the black masjids that were already there. And eventually, because African American Muslims were so open and willing to engage, their brothers and sisters in Islam, because this was the dream of being Muslim, like Malcolm's dream, an internationalist vision, right? That we're all going to create this beloved community, this ummah, right? Which is the ideal of this religion. And so they will welcome them in. And slowly what I hear is the food starts changing.
Yep.
The language changes.
Yep.
Suddenly the khutbah is in Arabic or Urdu,
right?
Even though it's always supposed to be in the language of the land where you are.
Right.
And all of a sudden, there is a type of condescension, right? In those who are coming to a masjid that they didn't even build, right? So these types of kind of very deeply hurtful personal experiences really left an imprint on me. I mean, I don't want to kind of paint with huge, broad brushes either. Like, again, my parents are immigrants, right? And I understand that, they come with this idea that America is a dream, that it is a fresh place. And it's sort of like being sold something where it's like, look, you're not just here because, you deserve it.
Yeah.
Right? Your entire existence here has been built upon the labor, the backbreaking labor of others, right? Immigration.
To come with, and before we run out of time, but because I'm going to have you back, so I'm going to get to the rest of the book. I want to go to, quickly, switching gears, to page 182, a third language. And I happen to know Moja, and it's very interesting. And as an African-American Muslim female, I have to admit, it might be a shortcoming, I have put both hands up to feminism because it keeps morphing. And I understand white women's angst with their men about being in suburbia, but I don't know many Black women who have had a chance to have that angst, or even if given the chance, would like to have it. So I put my hands up. But one of the things about Moja and her book, A Girl in the Tangerine Scarf,
right,
that I loved was it brought me closer to understanding something that I couldn't understand, and why feminism means a particular kind of liberation for some Muslim women who have been under the hand of. So you want to talk about that chapter?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to preface it by saying, just like you, I struggled so much with even using that term,
Right.
Muslim feminism, because many of the people in this photo that you see here, Sister Aisha Al-Dawiya, Hazel Gomez, Asifa Qureshi Landis, and Leila Al-Mariati, these four amazing women that I interviewed to hear about how they live their lives as Muslim women who are deeply engaged in their communities, in politics, in Islamic practices, education, etc. I don't think any of them self-identified as a feminist. And so, my inclination is you cannot label someone something that they do not call themselves. But what I kind of my decision for using the term was because, as someone who works in the academy, in an institution of in a department of women's gender and sexuality studies, and in which feminist studies is a field, right, in which people talk about this, I am livid when Muslim women and their work and their labor and their struggles and their activism is not included in the larger language and understanding and history of feminism in the United States, right? And so even though it is not feminism in that second wave mold where you have a particular political agenda or a certain demographic, it is part of the history of women striving for justice in this country. And so I call it that so that it is situated in that history.
Well, I'm going to beg you, because we're out of time, to come on for part 2 of this, and also do my cuties.
Oh, right. I
want to add Shabana Mir, who's on here with us, to this conversation, because this is one of the things that she thinks about long and hard. Mm-hmm. And I know her, and I think that would enlarge our conversation on this sex and sexuality and gender stuff is really, really important. And it has, as Shabana, you can see in her comment, is you got immigrant women silenced by male gatekeepers, and I'm saying burn down the gate, but I'll leave that for a different series. But I want us to come back, and if I can get that she's saying yes, and we're gonna have part 2. Use the book as our foundation, and we will come back. And I want to thank you so much. This has been, again, the fastest damn 50 minutes on the planet.
I know, what happened?
I don't know, but we will come back. Thank you very much, Dr. Chan Malik. And this is Professor Amina Al-Din with Critical Talk, and there will be a part 2.
All right. Thank you so much. It was so much fun. I love it.
All right. Stay on.